When seven-time Formula One champion Lewis Hamilton stepped into Nelson Mandela's prison cell on Robben Island, he expected a moment of reflection. What he found instead was a hidden legacy, a secret mission that would transform him from racing icon to global humanitarian. Following cryptic clues left by Mandela himself, Hamilton embarked on a dangerous journey across South Africa to recover priceless cultural artifacts stolen during colonialism and apartheid. The choice he made there would stun the world, rippling through museums and governments across continents, and ultimately lead him to sacrifice the career that made him famous to fulfill a promise decades in the making. Lewis Hamilton wiped beads of sweat from his forehead as he removed his racing helmet. The roar of the crowd at the Kyalami circuit still rang in his ears. He had just won the South African Grand Prix, pushing his Mercedes to the limit on every turn of the historic track. "Great driving today, Lewis," said his race engineer, Marcus, handing him a bottle of water. "Thanks," Lewis replied, taking a long drink. The car felt amazing through those final laps. The victory had been hard-fought. Lewis had started in fourth position, but managed to overtake his rivals with careful tire management and perfect timing. Now, as he walked back to the team's garage, fans pressed against barriers, hoping for autographs. Lewis smiled and waved, stopping to sign a few programs and caps. This was his first race in South Africa, a country he had always wanted to visit. The circuit near Johannesburg had recently been renovated and added back to the Formula One calendar after decades of absence. Back in the privacy of the team area, Lewis changed out of his racing suit. The team was celebrating. This win had extended his championship lead. But instead of joining them, Lewis felt a strange pull to be alone with his thoughts. South Africa meant something special to him. Growing up as the only black driver in a predominantly white sport, he had drawn inspiration from figures like Nelson Mandela. "There's some mail for you," said Maya, his personal assistant, interrupting his thoughts. "Most of it can wait until we're back in Europe, but this one was hand-delivered. The person was quite insistent you receive it today." She handed him a simple, cream-colored envelope. No official markings, just his name written in careful penmanship on the front. Lewis raised an eyebrow. "Did you see who brought it?" he asked. "An older gentleman, very dignified. He wouldn't leave a name, just said you would understand once you read it." Lewis turned the envelope over in his hands. In his position, unsolicited mail was usually screened thoroughly. Yet something about this felt different. "It's been checked," Maya assured him, reading his concern. "Nothing dangerous." Lewis nodded and slid his finger under the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and something small and hard. A smooth stone, pale gray with flecks of white. He set the stone on the table and unfolded the letter. "Mr. Hamilton, my name is Themba Radebe. You do not know me, but I knew Nelson Mandela during his time on Robben Island. I served as a prison guard there for 20 years. What few people know is that Madiba trusted me with certain matters that have remained private until now. He spoke often of a future South Africa where people would be judged by their character, not their color. Before his passing, he left instructions that certain information should be shared with someone who understands both struggle and triumph, someone who has broken barriers. The stone enclosed comes from the limestone quarry where prisoners worked each day. Mandela's eyes were permanently damaged from the sun's reflection on the white stone. Yet, he chose to keep this piece, saying it reminded him that even the hardest substance can be shaped by persistence. If you wish to understand more, I invite you to visit Robben Island. I will meet you there tomorrow at 10 a.m. Come alone, or with minimal company. Some journeys are meant to be taken quietly. The choice is yours. Either way, congratulations on your victory today. Madiba would have smiled to see it. Respectfully, Themba Radebe Lewis read the letter twice, then picked up the stone. It was smooth, likely worn down by years of handling. The idea that it might have been touched by Mandela sent a strange shiver through him. "Everything okay?" Maya asked, noticing his expression. "I'm not sure," Lewis said honestly. "I need to change our plans. Instead of flying out tomorrow, I want to visit Robben Island." Maya looked surprised. "The prison? We have commitments in Monaco in 3 days." "I know." Lewis turned the stone over in his palm. "But this feels important. Can you arrange it? Just you, me, and maybe Dion, for security." Maya nodded, already, pulling out her phone. "I'll make it happen." "Should I tell the team?" Lewis considered this. His team would want a reason, and he wasn't sure what to tell them yet. "Just say I'm taking an extra day for some personal matters. I'll deal with any fallout." After Maya left, Lewis sat alone, turning the stone over and over. Throughout his career, he had received countless letters from fans and strangers. What made this one feel so significant? Perhaps it was being in South Africa, a place whose history of struggle and triumph mirrored some of his own experiences in racing. Or perhaps it was the mention of Mandela, a man whose courage had inspired millions, including Lewis himself. Whatever awaited him on Robben Island, Lewis felt certain of one thing. This was a detour he needed to take. Racing had given him a platform, but he had always believed his purpose extended beyond trophies and championships. He slipped the stone into his pocket. Tomorrow, he would find out what message Nelson Mandela had left for him, and why, of all people, he had been chosen to receive it. The ferry rocked gently as it cut through the waters of Table Bay. Lewis stood at the railing, watching Cape Town's iconic Table Mountain grow smaller behind them. The morning air carried a salty chill, and dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain. "Weather report says a storm's coming in," said Dion, his security guard, a tall South African man with watchful eyes. "We should be able to visit the island and get back before it hits, but it might be close." Lewis nodded, his hand instinctively touching the stone in his pocket. After receiving the mysterious letter, he had spent half the night researching Robben Island and Nelson Mandela's imprisonment. The images of the tiny cells and harsh conditions had kept him awake. "I still think we should have verified this Themba person before coming," Maya said, joining them at the railing. "It could be nothing, or it could be everything," Lewis replied, quietly. "Sometimes you have to trust your instincts." The ferry carried about 30 passengers, mostly tourists with cameras and guidebooks. No one had recognized Lewis yet. The baseball cap and sunglasses helped, but mostly it was that people weren't expecting to see a Formula One champion on the morning ferry to Robben Island. A young woman approached them, extending her hand. "I'm Lindiwe Nkosi, your guide for today. The museum assigned me specially when they heard you were coming, Mr. Hamilton." Lewis shook her hand. "Thank you for accommodating us on such short notice. I was hoping to keep this visit low-key." "Of course." The director was quite surprised, but very pleased. Lindiwe smiled. "Few people know this, but Nelson Mandela was a great sports enthusiast. He believed sport could unite people across all divides." "Yes, I've read about how he used the 1995 Rugby World Cup to bring South Africans together," Lewis said. Lindiwe nodded approvingly. "Exactly. The Springboks were once a symbol of apartheid, but Mandela transformed them into a symbol of the new South Africa." She looked at Lewis thoughtfully. "Perhaps he would see something similar in your achievements." The ferry horn sounded as they approached the island. From a distance, Robben Island looked almost peaceful, a flat patch of land with a few scattered buildings. It was hard to imagine it had been a place of such suffering. "Have you heard of someone named Themba Radebe?" Lewis asked Lindiwe. "He was supposedly a guard here." A flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Themba Radebe. Yes, I believe he worked here during Mandela's imprisonment. He's quite elderly now. There were rumors he was sympathetic to the prisoners, though he had to be careful about showing it." She tilted her head. "Why do you ask?" "He sent me a letter, asked me to meet him here today." Lindiwe's eyes widened. "That's unusual. He rarely speaks about his time here. Most former guards don't." The ferry docked, and passengers began disembarking. The island's stillness was immediately noticeable, a heavy silence that seemed to echo its painful history. "This way," Lindiwe said, leading them toward a bus that would take visitors on the standard tour. "We'll start with, is there a way we could begin at the prison cells?" Lewis interrupted. "I'm supposed to meet someone there at 10. Lindiwe checked her watch. "We can arrange that, though it's not the usual order." As they walked toward the main prison complex, the wind picked up, bringing with it the first drops of rain. The island suddenly felt more desolate, its rocky shores and sparse vegetation stark against the darkening sky. The island was a prison for nearly 400 years before the apartheid government began sending political prisoners here, Lindiwe explained as they walked. It was chosen for its isolation. Escape was nearly impossible. The waters are cold and filled with sharks, and the nearest shore is kilometers away. Lewis listened intently, trying to imagine what it must have been like for Mandela and others to arrive here, knowing they might never leave. They approached the limestone quarry where prisoners had been forced to work. The glare from these white stones damaged many prisoners' eyes, Lindiwe said, including Mandela's. Yet there's something powerful here too. The prisoners would use their break times to teach each other, to discuss politics and ideas. They called it University of Robben Island. Lewis felt the weight of the stone in his pocket grow heavier. As they neared the prison building, Lewis noticed an elderly man waiting by the entrance. He stood very straight despite his age, with close-cropped, white hair and deep lines etched into his dark skin. "That's him," Lewis said quietly. "That must be Themba." The old man watched them approach, his expression unreadable. When they were a few meters away, he stepped forward. "Mr. Hamilton," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "You came." "Your letter was compelling," Lewis replied, studying the man's face. There was dignity there, and something else, a hint of burden perhaps. "I wasn't certain you would believe me," Themba said. "Many would have dismissed an old man's story. I've learned that sometimes the most important truths come from unexpected places," Lewis said. Themba nodded slowly, seeming to evaluate Lewis with new appreciation. Wise words for a young man. He glanced at the others. "You brought friends." "My assistant Maya, my security Dion, and this is Lindiwe, our guide." Themba acknowledged each with a nod, then turned back to Lewis. "What I have to share is for your ears first, but they may join us for the beginning of our tour." Thunder rumbled in the distance as they entered the prison complex, its corridors cold and echoing. Lewis felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. Whatever awaited him here would change something. He could feel it. "This way," Themba said, leading them deeper into the prison. "Let me show you where history was both imprisoned and born." The prison corridors echoed with their footsteps, each sound bouncing off the cement walls and concrete floors. Lewis felt a heaviness in the air, not just from the approaching storm outside, but from the weight of history these walls contained. "Watch your step," Themba said, his voice reverberating slightly. "After all these years, some of the floors are uneven." Lewis nodded, taking in everything. The corridor was plain. Whitewashed walls, fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows, and numbered doors that marked each cell. Everything about the place was designed to strip away individuality. The prison was organized by sections, Themba explained as they walked. Common criminals were housed separately from political prisoners. The authorities feared the political prisoners would contaminate others with their ideas of freedom and equality. Lewis noticed how Themba walked, precise steps, hands clasped behind his back, eyes forward. Even decades later, he still carried himself like a guard. "How long did you work here?" Lewis asked. 22 years, Themba replied. "I started in 1964, the same year Mandela arrived, and left in 1986, when things began changing in the country. They turned a corner, entering a wider hallway with a central guard station." Themba paused, resting his hand on the worn wooden desk. "From here, we monitored all movement," he said. Political prisoners were allowed out of their cells only at specific times, for meals, for exercise, for work in the quarry. Every minute was scheduled and supervised. Lindiwe, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. The routine was part of the punishment. Nothing to look forward to, no variation, nothing to mark the passage of time except more of the same. Themba nodded. "Exactly. Breaking a man's connection to time is one way to break his spirit." He looked directly at Lewis. But Mandela and others found ways to resist even this. They created their own markers of time, with studies, with secret messages, with small acts of defiance. They continued down the corridor toward a large window that overlooked the prison yard, a barren stretch of ground surrounded by high walls. "This is where they exercised," Themba said. 1 hour each day, walking in circles or playing soccer, with balls made from rolled-up paper and rags. Later, they were allowed actual footballs. Lewis imagined Mandela walking in circles year after year, decade after decade, yet somehow maintaining his dignity and purpose. "And the quarry?" Lewis asked. "Where they worked?" "Just beyond those walls," Themba pointed. "That's where the stone came from, the one I sent you." Lewis touched his pocket where the stone rested. "You said Mandela kept it as a reminder." "Yes, he collected several such stones. Most prisoners hated the quarry. The work was hard, the sun blinding off the white limestone. But Mandela said it taught him patience, chipping away day after day, like they were chipping away at apartheid itself." They passed a small room filled with metal tables bolted to the floor. "The visiting room," Lindiwe explained. Political prisoners were allowed one visitor every 6 months for just 30 minutes. They spoke through a glass partition and were forbidden to touch. "Mandela didn't see his children for years," Themba added quietly. "When he finally did, they were grown. His youngest daughter was just 3 when he was imprisoned. She was an adult before she could touch her father's hand." Lewis felt a tightness in his chest. He thought of his own family, how his father had worked multiple jobs to support his racing dreams, how they had sacrificed together. "How did they endure it?" he asked softly. "By focusing on something bigger than themselves," Themba answered. "By understanding that their struggle wasn't just for them, but for generations to come." He gave Lewis a meaningful look. "Much like breaking barriers in your own field, Mr. Hamilton." They turned down another corridor, narrower than the last. The cells here were smaller, each door marked with a number. "B section," Themba announced. "This is where the political prisoners were kept. The leaders, Mandela, Sisulu, Kathrada, and others were isolated even from other political prisoners. They wanted to prevent them from organizing. Lewis peered through the small window of one cell. Just enough space for a mat on the floor, a small table, and a bucket in the corner. "No toilet facilities?" Maya asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the prison. "No," Themba shook his head. "Just a bucket, emptied once a day. No privacy, minimal hygiene. The authorities tried everything to humiliate them," Lindiwe added. "Black prisoners received less food than colored or Indian prisoners. They were given shorts instead of long pants, symbolizing that black men were to be treated like boys." Dayon, who had been silently assessing every room and corridor with professional vigilance, spoke up. Yet they maintained their dignity. "Yes," Themba agreed. "That was perhaps their greatest victory here. The regime could control their bodies, but never conquered their minds." They approached the end of the corridor, where a particular cell stood, slightly apart from the others. The number 46664 was painted on the door. 466/64, Themba explained. Prisoner number 466 of 1964. Nelson Mandela's cell. Lewis stood before the door, staring at the numbers. So much history condensed into a simple code. This cell, just over 7 square meters, housed one of the greatest leaders of our time for 18 years, Lindiwe said. After that, he was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison and later to Victor Verster Prison before his release in 1990. Thunder crashed outside, louder now, and rain began pattering against the small windows high in the walls. "The storm has arrived," Themba noted. "Perhaps fitting for what comes next." He turned to Lindiwe, Maya, and Dayon. "Would you give Mr. Hamilton and me a moment alone? There are things I must share with him privately." Lindiwe looked surprised. "That's not our usual protocol." "I understand," Themba said with a slight smile. "But then, this is not a usual visit." "It's okay," Lewis assured them. "I'll be fine." After a moment's hesitation, Lindiwe nodded. "We'll wait in the entrance hall. Take your time." As the others walked away, their footsteps fading down the corridor, Themba turned to Lewis. "Before we enter his cell, I must tell you something," the old man said, his voice dropping. "I wasn't entirely truthful in my letter." Lewis felt a flicker of apprehension. "About what?" "About who I was on this island." Themba's eyes held Lewis's, steadily. "I told you I was a guard." That was not the complete truth. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, tarnished key. "This opens the cell of Nelson Mandela," he said. "And now I will tell you why it was given to me, and why Madiba wanted someone like you to receive what waits inside." Lewis felt his heart beating faster as Themba placed the key in his hand. Whatever journey had brought him to this moment seemed both random and inevitable, like every turn that had led him through his racing career, every barrier he had broken. "Are you ready?" Themba asked. Lewis nodded, clutching the key. "Yes." The key felt heavy in Lewis's hand, far heavier than its small size suggested. Themba stepped aside, allowing Lewis to approach the cell door. The lock was old, its metal worn, from years of use. Lewis inserted the key, feeling resistance as he turned it. The mechanism clicked, and the door creaked open. "Go in," Themba said softly. "Take your time." Lewis stepped into the cell, immediately struck by its smallness. 3 steps would cover its length, 2 its width. The ceiling hung low, adding to the sense of confinement. A thin mat lay rolled in one corner, a recreation of the bedding Mandela would have used. A small wooden table stood against one wall. with a metal bowl and cup, a wooden stool, a bucket. Nothing more. The high window allowed only a narrow shaft of light, now dimmed by the storm clouds outside. Rain tapped against the glass like impatient fingers. 18 years in this space, Louis whispered, almost to himself. Yes, Themba replied from the doorway. Every morning at 5:30, he would roll his mat, empty his bucket, and prepare for another day of the same. Yet somehow, he used this confinement to grow stronger, not weaker. Louis ran his hand along the rough stone wall, feeling its cold solidity. You said you weren't completely truthful about who you were. Themba nodded slowly. I was not a guard, Mr. Hamilton. I was a prisoner. Number 19865. He touched his chest, where the number would have been written on his prison clothes. I was sentenced to 12 years for terrorism, which meant I had helped hide ANC members fleeing the police. Louis turned to face him, surprised. But the letter was necessary to ensure you would come, Themba explained. If I had identified myself as a former prisoner, the authorities might have intercepted my message. Some old habits of caution remain with me even now. You knew Mandela as a fellow prisoner then? Yes. A faint smile crossed Themba's weathered face. We worked side by side in the quarry for many years. He taught me to read English properly. I shared with him news smuggled in from my visitors. When he was denied his own, Themba entered the cell fully now, closing the door behind him. The space felt even smaller with two people inside. He touched the wall reverently. What few people know is that Madiba, that's what we called him, his clan name, established a network among us. Messages passed from cell to cell, written on tiny scraps of paper or whispered during work. We created a community inside these walls, a government in waiting. Louis listened intently, trying to imagine the courage this would have required. The guards thought they were watching us every moment, Themba continued. But there were ways, small moments when we could exchange words, papers, ideas. Mandela was writing even then, drafting what would later become his autobiography. Den, in the cell? Louis asked, looking around the barren space. Hidden in plain sight, he buried pages in the prison yard, tucked them into crevices in the quarry. Themba smiled at the memory. He said words couldn't be imprisoned, even if men could. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the cell through the small window. Thunder followed almost immediately. But I didn't ask you here just to tell you about the past, Themba said. Madiba left something behind, something few people know about. He walked to the corner of the cell where the sleeping mat lay and knelt. With some difficulty, his aged fingers felt along the edge of the floor, finding a spot where the cement met the wall. "Help me here," he said, gesturing for Louis to kneel beside him. Louis joined him, watching as Themba pressed against what appeared to be a loose piece of cement. It gave way slightly, revealing a small cavity in the wall. Before he was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison in 1982, Mandela knew he might never return to this cell, Themba explained. He called me here one night. I was working in the prison kitchen by then, which gave me some freedom of movement. He showed me this hiding place and what he had concealed inside. Themba reached into the cavity and removed a small bundle wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, preserved despite the decades. He made me promise that if South Africa became free in our lifetime, I would find someone worthy to receive this, someone who understood both struggle and victory. Themba looked at Louis with penetrating eyes. When I saw you racing, a black man dominating a sport that once would have excluded you, I remembered his words. He carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small journal with worn covers and yellowed pages. This contains writings he couldn't include in his official autobiography. Thoughts too personal, or perhaps too controversial, even for a man known for speaking truth. Themba held the journal but didn't yet give it to Lewis. But there's more to it than words. The last few pages contain a map and instructions. Instructions for what? Lewis asked, his voice hushed in the small space. Before his arrest, Mandela helped secure items of great cultural significance, artifacts that the apartheid government was systematically destroying or sending to European museums, things that belonged to the people of South Africa but were being erased from our history. Lewis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold cell. Where are these items now? That's what the journal will tell you. Madiba couldn't complete this mission himself. He hoped someone would finish what he started, returning these treasures to their rightful communities. Outside, the storm intensified, rain now drumming against the prison walls. The sound created an oddly private atmosphere, as if the weather were providing cover for their conversation. "Why me?" Lewis asked, the question that had been nagging at him since receiving the letter. "I'm not South African. I'm a racing driver, not an activist or politician." Themba considered this. Mandela believed in the power of symbols. "You've broken barriers, Mr. Hamilton. You've succeeded in a world that wasn't designed for someone like you." He paused. "And there's something else, something he couldn't have known, but would have appreciated." "What's that?" "Your racing number, 44. Themba smiled. "Did you know that if you add the digits in Mandela's prison number, 46664, they sum to 26? And 2 plus 6 equals 8, Lewis said. "Like my world championships." "No," Themba corrected gently. "They equal 8, like the number of years Mandela was president." "Numbers have meaning in our culture, Mr. Hamilton. Coincidences aren't always coincidental." Themba finally handed the journal to Lewis. "Take this. Read it. Decide what to do. But before you make your decision, I want you to experience something Mandela often spoke about." "What's that?" "Solitude in confinement." Themba stood slowly, his joints crackling with age. "I'm going to leave you here alone for 1 hour, the same hour Mandela spent each day in silent meditation, finding inner freedom while physically imprisoned." Lewis looked alarmed. "You're locking me in?" "With your permission, I'll return in exactly 1 hour." Themba's expression was serious. Mandela said he discovered his true self in these moments of isolation. "Perhaps you will discover something too." Lewis hesitated, looking around the tiny cell. The thought of being locked in, even briefly, sent a spike of anxiety through him. Yet something about this man and this moment compelled him to agree. "All right," he said finally. 1 hour. Themba nodded with approval. "Use the time to begin reading the journal. And remember, Mandela spent not 1 hour, but more than 6,000 days in spaces like this." He stepped back through the door, key in hand. 1 hour, Mr. Hamilton. Then your real journey begins." The door closed with a metallic finality, and Lewis heard the key turn in the lock. He was alone in Nelson Mandela's cell, the journal in his hands, rain drumming against the window, and time suddenly, strangely, standing still. For several minutes, Lewis simply stood in the center of the cell, letting the reality of his confinement sink in. The space felt different now that he was alone. Smaller somehow, more oppressive. The sound of rain intensified, and occasional flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the rough walls before plunging the cell back into dim gray light. 1 hour, he whispered to himself. Just 1 hour. He sat down on the wooden stool, the only furniture besides the small table. The journal felt warm in his hands, as if it held not just words, but energy, the thoughts and hopes of a man who had changed history from within these walls. Lewis placed the small stone from Themba's letter on the table beside him. Then, carefully, he opened the journal to its first page. The handwriting was precise and methodical, small, neat letters that maximized the use of space on the page. Lewis recognized it immediately from having seen Mandela's writing in museums and books on July 12, 1976. The children of Soweto have reminded us what courage looks like. Word has reached us of their uprising, some as young as 13, facing bullets with nothing but stones and their conviction. The guards are nervous. They know something has shifted. The young have lost their fear. Lewis felt a chill. The Soweto uprising, when thousands of black schoolchildren protested against being forced to learn in Afrikaans, the language of their oppressors. Many had been killed when police opened fire. He had read about it, but seeing Mandela's immediate reaction, written in real time, made history feel suddenly present. He turned the page. October 3, 1977. They told us today of Steve Biko's death. Brain injury during interrogation, they called it. Murder by any honest name. I did not show emotion when the guard relayed the news with barely concealed satisfaction. To show grief is to give them power. But tonight, in this cell, I can admit that I weep for my brother, for his family, for our struggle that has lost a brilliant mind. What they do not understand is that for every leader they silence, 10 more will rise. Steve knew this. It is why he smiled, even as they tortured him. This is what gives me peace, even in this cell. Lewis swallowed hard. The intimate thoughts of Mandela confronting the death of anti-apartheid activist Steve Biko hit him with unexpected force. He had grown up hearing about these figures, but reading Mandela's private reflections made them real in a way history books never had. Outside, thunder crashed so loudly that the walls seemed to vibrate. Lewis looked up at the small window, noticing how the rain streaked down the glass. How many storms had Mandela watched through that same window? How many seasons had passed while he sat in this same spot? Lewis reached into his pocket and withdrew the stone Themba had sent with his letter. He turned it over in his palm, feeling its smoothness. From the quarry where Mandela had labored, where the sun had reflected off white limestone and damaged his eyes. Yet, he had kept a piece of it, finding meaning in the very thing designed to break him. He returned to the journal, flipping forward several pages. May 10, 1981. 15 years on this island today. The young guard, Van Niekerk, wished me happy anniversary this morning. I believe he meant it kindly, though his superior reprimanded him for speaking to me unnecessarily. Later, he slipped me a newspaper clipping about the artifacts taken from the eastern homelands. Another piece of our culture, our history, removed. Added to the list of what must be reclaimed when freedom comes. Lewis paused, remembering what Themba had said about artifacts. He flipped to the back of the journal as Themba had indicated. The last dozen pages contained drawings, detailed maps with locations marked, and what appeared to be inventory lists. Zulu beadwork necklaces. 4. Healing ceremonial Josa. Divination bones, complete set. Ancestral communication, ceremonial walking stick. Chief Langalibalele, 1873. Basotho blanket, royal pattern, pre-colonial trade, San Roque painting fragment, rescued from demolition site, Ndebele ceremonial copper. Rings 3, female initiation. The list continued, each item carefully described with its cultural significance noted. Beside many entries were small notes about their origin or how they had been obtained. Some had been rescued from museums about to send them overseas. Others had been hidden by families who feared their cultural items would be confiscated or destroyed. At the very end of the journal, a separate piece of paper had been carefully tucked between the pages. Lewis unfolded it to find a letter, dated just weeks before Mandela's transfer from Robben Island. To the finder of this journal, if you are reading these words, then my trusted friend has determined you worthy of this task. The items documented here represent pieces of a heritage that our oppressors have tried to erase. They are scattered now, hidden in various locations for their protection. The primary collection was entrusted to Reverend Ambrose at St. Augustine's Mission before my arrest. The mission has since closed, but the items were moved according to the coded map on the previous page. The first location contains not just artifacts, but documentation tracing the systematic theft of our cultural treasures. Evidence that may, someday, help reclaim what was taken from Africa and sent to European museums. Why is this important? Because a people disconnected from their past are easier to control. By preserving these pieces, we preserve not just objects, but identity, memory, and dignity. Whoever you are, I trust you understand that some struggles continue beyond prison walls, beyond political freedom. The liberation of our cultural heritage is one such struggle. With hope for a future where these treasures can be displayed with pride in a free South Africa, N.R. Mandela Lewis sat back, the weight of what he was reading sinking in. This wasn't just about artifacts. It was about reclaiming history that had been systematically erased. He noticed something else about the stone in his hand. In the dim light, he hadn't seen it before, but there appeared to be small markings etched into its surface. Not natural formations, but deliberately carved symbols. And the key Themba had given him seemed to have unusual notches that didn't match a standard prison lock. A sudden realization dawned on him. The stone and key weren't just symbolic tokens. They were actual keys to understanding the map in the journal. The markings on the stone matched patterns on the map, and the unusual shape of the key might be a decoder of some kind. As Lewis made these connections, he became aware of footsteps echoing down the corridor. His hour must be nearly up. He quickly returned the journal to its cloth wrapping and slipped it into his jacket pocket alongside the stone. The lock turned, and the door opened to reveal Themba standing in the corridor. "Your hour is complete, Mr. Hamilton," he said. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Lewis stood, feeling changed somehow by his time in the cell. "I'm not sure what I was looking for," he admitted, "but I found something I wasn't expecting." Themba nodded knowingly. "That is often the way with journeys that matter." He gestured toward the corridor. "Your friends are waiting anxiously. Shall we join them?" "Yes," Lewis said, stepping out of the cell. "But first, I need to understand more about these artifacts, about what Mandela was trying to protect." Themba led Lewis to a small room off the main corridor. Unlike the stark cells they had just left, this space had a table and several chairs, a room probably used for prison administration in the past, now repurposed for the museum. "We can speak more freely here," Themba said, closing the door behind them. "Your companions will join us shortly." Lewis took a seat, placing the journal, stone, and key on the table between them. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain lashing against the windows. "I've read parts of the journal," Lewis said, "and I found the list of artifacts, along with Mandela's letter. but there's something about this stone and key that seems important." Themba nodded, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "You noticed? Good. Madiba always said the most important messages are hidden in plain sight." He picked up the stone, turning it to catch the light from the overhead lamp. "Look here. These markings aren't random. They're coordinates." Lewis leaned forward, studying the tiny etchings. What he had initially taken for natural imperfections in the limestone were actually deliberate marks, a series of small notches and lines arranged in a pattern. "A location code?" Lewis asked. "Yes, but encrypted. The apartheid government monitored everything. Writing down actual coordinates would have been too risky." Themba set down the stone and picked up the key. "This is the decoder. The notches on the key align with the markings on the stone." Lewis watched as Themba demonstrated, lining up the key with the stone's markings. When properly aligned, you can read the true coordinates. It's an old resistance trick, hiding information in ordinary objects. "Extraordinary," Lewis murmured, seeing how the system worked. "But what about the map in the journal? It doesn't show actual locations, just symbols and what look like landmarks." "That's the second layer of security," Themba explained. "The map shows relative positions, distances and directions from known landmarks that would mean nothing to authorities, but everything to someone familiar with South Africa." Lewis was impressed. Even imprisoned, Mandela had created a sophisticated system to protect information. "What exactly are these artifacts?" The journal mentions cultural items, but why were they so important that Mandela was concerned with them, even while fighting for basic freedoms? Themba's expression grew solemn. "You must understand something about colonization and apartheid, Mr. Hamilton. It wasn't just about controlling land and people. It was about erasing identity. Our languages were banned in schools. Our histories were rewritten. Our cultural objects were either destroyed as primitive or shipped to European museums as specimens." He leaned forward, his voice dropping, though they were alone. "When you remove a people's connection to their past, you make it harder for them to imagine a future of their own making." Mandela understood this. Even while fighting for political freedom, he was working to preserve cultural memory. "So these artifacts are pieces of a heritage nearly erased," Themba finished. "Some are sacred items passed down through generations. Others are everyday objects that show the sophistication of African societies before colonization. Together, they tell a story that contradicts the narrative that Africans had no history worth preserving." Lewis nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "And the documentation Mandela mentioned about systematic theft?" "Perhaps the most valuable item of all," Themba said. "Before his arrest, Mandela was a lawyer. He collected evidence, records, receipts, letters, showing how museums and collectors acquired African artifacts. Many items were simply taken during colonial rule. Others were purchased for pittances under duress. Evidence that could support repatriation claims," Lewis realized, thinking of recent debates about returning colonial-era acquisitions to their countries of origin. Exactly. Not just for South Africa, but potentially for many African nations. A knock at the door interrupted them. Maya opened it cautiously. "Lewis, everything okay?" "We were getting worried." "We're fine," Lewis assured her. "Come in, all of you." Maya, Dion, and Lindiwe entered, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. "I was just explaining the significance of what Mr. Mandela left behind," Themba told them. "And did you show him what was hidden in the stone?" Lindiwe asked, surprising both Lewis and Themba. "You know about this?" Lewis asked. Lindiwe nodded. "Not all the details, but yes. I'm not just a tour guide, Mr. Hamilton. I'm a historian specializing in cultural heritage repatriation. Themba contacted me after seeing you win the Grand Prix. We've been working together to find the right person to continue Mandela's work. Louis looked between them. You planned this together? The letter was genuine, Themba assured him. The choice to come was yours alone. But yes, we hoped you would accept our invitation. Louis picked up the stone again, examining it more carefully. You said something was hidden inside? Themba and Lindiwe exchanged glances. The stone has a secret compartment, Lindiwe explained. The outer layer is limestone from the quarry, but it was hollowed out to hide a microfilm. She demonstrated how the stone could be twisted apart along an almost invisible seam. Inside was a tiny canister, no bigger than a pill. This contains locations, far more specific than what's in the journal, Themba said. Mandela updated this information regularly through messages smuggled in and out of prison. It's the key to finding everything. Why are you sharing this with me now? Louis asked. Why not just tell me from the beginning? We needed to be sure, Lindiwe said simply. Anyone can express admiration for Mandela. We needed to see how you would respond to his actual experience. The confinement, the isolation, the weight of history. And? Louis asked. You passed, Themba said with a slight smile. You didn't just read the journal. You understood what wasn't written. You saw the connection between the stone and the key without being told. Thunder crashed outside as if punctuating his words. So what happens now? Louis asked, looking at the small collection of items on the table. Humble objects that somehow contained an extraordinary secret. Now, Themba said, you decide if you're willing to follow the map where it leads. Louis stared at the items on the table, the journal, the stone with its hidden compartment, the key that was both literal and figurative. Outside, the storm had begun to ease, rain softening to a gentle patter against the windows. I have a race in Monaco in 3 days, he said finally. A championship to defend. Themba nodded, his expression neutral. Of course, your obligations are significant. And I'm not South African, Louis continued, more to himself than to the others. This isn't my heritage, my history. Isn't it? Lindiwe asked quietly. The struggle against racism, against systems designed to keep certain people in their proper place. Isn't that something you've faced in your own way? Louis didn't answer immediately. He thought about his journey in racing, the often subtle, but sometimes blatant resistance to his presence in the sport. The comments, the double standards, the constant need to be twice as good just to be considered equal. There's another consideration, Dion spoke up, his security professional's instincts evident. If these artifacts are as valuable as you suggest, there will be people looking for them. Collectors, dealers, maybe even government officials who'd rather these items and documents remain hidden. That's certainly true, Themba acknowledged, which is why they've remained concealed all these years. Finding the right person was essential, someone with both the resources to undertake this task and the principles to complete it properly. Maya, who had remained silent until now, placed a hand on Louis's shoulder. Whatever you decide, you know the team will adapt the schedule if this is important to you. You've earned that flexibility. Louis picked up the journal again, running, his fingers over Mandela's handwriting. He thought about the hours he had just spent in that tiny cell, just 1 hour, when Mandela had endured years. He thought about his own platform, the voice he had earned through his success, and how often he had spoken about using that voice for more than just racing. If I do this, he said slowly, what exactly would it involve? How long would it take? The racing, First location is about a day's journey from here, Lindiwe explained, in the Eastern Cape province. That's where the main collection was hidden, along with the documentation. But there are smaller collections scattered across the country, Themba added. As a security measure, not all would need to be retrieved immediately. Lewis nodded, thinking through the logistics. And once found, what happens to the artifacts? That's part of what you would need to decide, Lindiwe said. Mandela's hope was that they would be returned to their communities of origin where possible, or placed in South African museums where they could be properly honored and displayed for all people to see and learn from. Not sold to private collectors or foreign museums, Themba emphasized. That would defeat the purpose entirely. Lewis reached for his phone, checking the time. It was nearly noon. "I need to make a call," he said. He stepped away from the table, dialing his team principal. The conversation was brief, but intense. Lewis explaining that he needed a week's extension on his return to Europe without giving specific details. There was resistance, as he expected, but also understanding. His position in the championship was strong. Missing a few days of preparation before Monaco wasn't ideal, but wouldn't be catastrophic. When he returned to the table, his mind was made up. "I'll follow this through, at least to the first location," he said. "After that, we'll see." Relief showed on both Themba and Lindiwe's faces. "A wise decision," Themba said. Mandela himself often said that we don't choose our callings. They choose us. "We should leave the island soon," Lindiwe noted, glancing outside. "The storm is passing, but the last ferry departs at 3. Lewis gathered the items from the table, carefully securing them in his jacket pockets. "What's our next step?" "We'll need transportation to the Eastern Cape," Lindiwe said, "and it would be best to travel discreetly." "I can arrange a private vehicle," Dion offered, "something inconspicuous." "And I'll create a cover story," Maya added. "Something about you exploring investment opportunities in South Africa. That should buy us some time without raising suspicions." Lewis nodded, grateful for their quick support. "When do we leave?" "First light tomorrow," Themba suggested. "The journey to the Eastern Cape takes several hours. We should arrive by nightfall. If we start early." As they prepared to leave the room, Lindiwe touched Lewis's arm lightly. "There's something else you should know," she said, her voice lowered. "You won't be the only ones looking for these artifacts." "What do you mean?" Lewis asked. "Rumors have circulated for years about Mandela's hidden collection. Most dismissed it as myth, but some have taken it seriously, particularly certain collectors who specialize in acquiring cultural items through unofficial channels." "Black market dealers," Dion translated bluntly. "Yes," Lindiwe confirmed. "We've been careful, but word may have spread that something is happening. We should proceed with caution." Lewis considered this new information. What had started as a mysterious invitation was evolving into something more complex, perhaps even dangerous. All the more reason not to delay, he decided. The sooner we secure these artifacts, the better. They left the small room and made their way back through the prison corridors toward the exit. As they walked, Lewis felt the weight of Mandela's journal against his chest. The choice had been made. Whatever lay ahead, he was now committed to a path that had been waiting nearly 30 years for someone to follow it. The morning sky was washed clean after the previous day's storm, dawn breaking in streaks of orange and pink over Table Mountain as Lewis and his companions gathered in the hotel parking lot. Dion had arranged for an unremarkable SUV, dark blue, locally manufactured, with tinted windows that offered some privacy without drawing attention. "Everything's packed," Maya said, closing the trunk. "I've arranged for your regular luggage to be shipped to Monaco. As far as the team knows, You're taking a few days to explore investment opportunities in South African sustainable energy." Lewis nodded, appreciating her efficiency. He wore simple clothes, jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a cap pulled low over his eyes. No designer labels, no team gear, nothing that would make him stand out. "Did you sleep at all?" Lindiwe asked him, noticing the shadows under his eyes. "Not much," Lewis admitted. "I spent most of the night reading through Mandela's journal." He patted his jacket pocket where the journal now rested. "It's powerful, more than I expected." Themba joined them, moving slowly but deliberately. Despite his age, he had insisted on accompanying them to the Eastern Cape. "The journey takes about 12 hours by car," he explained as they climbed into the vehicle. "We'll follow the coastal route through the Garden Route, then turn inland, toward the Eastern Cape province." Dion took the wheel, with Themba in the passenger seat to navigate. Lewis, Maya, and Lindiwe settled in the back seats as they pulled away from Cape Town, the city still quiet in the early morning light. As they drove, the urban landscape gradually gave way to stunning coastal scenery, the road winding between mountains and ocean, with dramatic cliffs dropping to turquoise waters. Under different circumstances, Lewis would have found it purely beautiful. Now, his mind was occupied with what lay ahead. "Tell me more about these artifacts," he said to Themba after they had been driving for an hour. "The journal lists them, but I want to understand their significance better." Themba shifted in his seat to face him. "They represent different aspects of South African heritage, items from various cultural groups that make up our nation. The Zulu beadwork, for example, isn't just decorative. Each pattern and color has meaning, telling stories about the wearers, status, age, or even relationship status. Like a visual language," Lewis remarked. "Exactly. And the divination bones. Those were used by traditional healers to communicate with ancestors, to diagnose illnesses, to make important community decisions. When missionaries and colonial authorities arrived, such practices were labeled as witchcraft and banned." Lindiwe joined in. "What makes this collection unique is that Mandela gathered items from across different cultural groups, not just his own Xhosa heritage. It's a pan-African approach, recognizing the diversity within South Africa." The landscape changed as they continued east, the coastal route giving way to rolling hills covered in lush vegetation. They stopped briefly in a small town for fuel and refreshments, keeping to themselves and attracting little attention. Back on the road, Themba pointed to distant hills. That area was once part of the Transkei homeland, one of the independent Bantustans created under apartheid. In reality, they were poverty-stricken reservations where Black South Africans were forced to live. Lewis took in the beautiful countryside, trying to reconcile it with its painful history. "Mandela grew up near here, didn't he?" "Yes, in a village called Kunu," Themba confirmed. "About 3 hours from where we're heading." "And where exactly are we heading?" Maya asked. Lindiwe unfolded a map on her lap. A former mission station called St. Augustine's. Founded by Anglican missionaries in the 1850s, it later became a school where many anti-apartheid leaders received their education. The mission closed in the 1970s, but the buildings remain. How did Mandela choose this location? Lewis wondered. The reverend who ran the mission, William Ambrose, was sympathetic to the anti-apartheid cause, Themba explained. He provided safe havens for ANC members and helped preserve cultural items that might otherwise have been destroyed. The roads gradually became narrower and less maintained as they turned inland, winding through hills and valleys. Small villages appeared occasionally, clusters of round, thatched roof homes painted in bright colors, with cattle grazing nearby and children playing alongside the road. We're entering deep rural South Africa now, Lindiwe said. Many of these communities maintain traditional ways of life alongside modern influences. By mid-afternoon, they pulled over at a scenic overlook. The landscape spread before them in a patchwork of greens and browns, rolling hills dotted with homesteads and grazing livestock. In the far distance, mountains rose in a purple haze. As they stretched their legs, a young man approached from a nearby vendor stall. Lewis tensed slightly, but the man simply offered them fresh fruit from his display. Dion handled the interaction, purchasing mangoes and speaking easily in what Lewis assumed was Xhosa. He says there's been unusual activity at the old mission, Dion reported as he returned with the fruit. People asking questions, foreigners in expensive cars. Themba and Lindiwe exchanged concerned glances. How would anyone know to look there? Lewis asked. Word travels, Themba said grimly. Perhaps someone connected to the mission remembered something. Or maybe there have been other attempts to find the collection over the years. Should we change our plans? Maya asked. Lindiwe shook her head. No, but we should be cautious. Let's approach from the back road instead of the main entrance, and perhaps arrive after sunset. They continued their journey, the mood in the vehicle now more tense. Dion drove with increased vigilance, checking the rearview mirror frequently for any signs of being followed. Late in the afternoon, they turned onto an unmarked dirt road that wound through increasingly remote countryside. The SUV bounced over potholes and ruts, dust billowing behind them. We're about an hour away, Themba announced as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, just beyond that ridge. Lewis stared out at the landscape, so different from the European cities and racing circuits that formed his usual environment. Here, the land felt ancient, the silence profound when they occasionally stopped the engine. He found himself wondering what other secrets it held, what stories were embedded in the soil and rocks around them. Look there, Lindiwe said suddenly, pointing to a distant hilltop. That's St. Augustine's. Lewis could just make out stone. Buildings silhouetted against the darkening sky. A cluster of structures dominated by what appeared to be a small church with a bell tower. And we're not alone, Dion added, his voice tight. There's a vehicle parked at the entrance. Squinting, Lewis could indeed see a black SUV much like their own positioned near the main gates of the mission. Who would be there at this hour? Maya wondered. That's what we need to find out, Themba said solemnly. But carefully. Whoever they are, they're looking for the same thing we are. Dion turned off their headlights and guided the vehicle onto an even smaller track that circled behind the mission complex. We'll approach from the rear, he said. Less chance of being spotted. As they drew closer to the abandoned mission, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Lewis felt the weight of Mandela's journal against his chest and the stone in his pocket. Whatever, or whoever, awaited them at St. Augustine's, they had come too far to turn back now. Dion parked their vehicle in a small grove of trees about 200 meters behind the mission buildings. The fading light painted the stone structures in deep purple and gold, giving them an almost mystical quality against the darkening sky. We should wait until full dark, Dion advised, keeping his voice low. Then approach on foot, Lewis nodded, peering through the windshield at the abandoned mission. From this angle, he could see several buildings, the church with its bell tower, what appeared to be a dormitory or school building, and several smaller structures, perhaps once homes for the missionaries. Do we know exactly where to look? He asked. Themba carefully removed the stone from his pocket and twisted it open, extracting the tiny microfilm canister. According to Mandela's notes, the main collection was hidden in the mission library. Is there still a library? Maya wondered. After all these years? The mission was abandoned rather than destroyed, Lindiwe explained. When funding was cut, in the 1970s, the missionaries simply left. Local people have treated the place with respect, partly out of religious reverence, partly because of its educational history. They waited as darkness fell completely, the southern stars emerging in brilliant clusters overhead. Finally, Dion decided it was time. "I'll go first," he said, checking that his flashlight was working but not yet turning it on. "Stay close and move quietly." They exited the vehicle and made their way across the open ground toward the mission. The moon had risen, providing just enough light to see their path without flashlights. Lewis could feel his heart pounding, a familiar sensation from race starts, but in an entirely different context. As they approached the rear of the main building, a sudden noise made them freeze. The sound of a car door closing, followed by voices from the front of the complex. "Down," Dion whispered, and they all crouched behind a low stone wall. The voices grew louder, speaking in English with accents Lewis couldn't quite place, perhaps Eastern European. Two beams of flashlight swept across the courtyard between buildings. "We should have brought proper equipment," one voice complained. "Ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors." "The boss wants us to be discreet," another replied. "Besides, we're looking for a specific location, not random digging." The flashlight beams moved toward the church building, then inside. Through the empty windows, Lewis could see the lights moving around the interior. "They don't know exactly where to look," Themba whispered. "That gives us an advantage." When the unknown searchers had entered the church, Dion motioned for the group to move quickly across the open space to the building Lindiwe had identified as the former library. The door was unlocked, simply a weathered wooden panel that creaked slightly as Dion pushed it open. They slipped inside and closed it behind them. Only then did Dion risk using his flashlight, keeping the beam pointed downward to minimize the chance of being seen from outside. The space was dusty, but largely intact. Wooden shelves still lined. The walls, though, most were empty. A few books remained, their bindings cracked and faded from years of heat and neglect. "Where exactly?" Lewis asked, keeping his voice just above a whisper. Themba consulted the microfilm, using a small magnifier he had brought for this purpose. "According to this, there's a hidden compartment beneath the librarian's desk." They moved further into the room, finding an old wooden desk positioned near the far wall. Years of dust had settled on its surface, undisturbed until their arrival. "No one has touched this in a long time," Maya observed. "That's a good sign." Dion examined the floor around the desk, tapping gently with his knuckles. "Here," he said after a moment. "This section sounds different." He brushed away decades of dust to reveal a slight seam in the floorboards. Using a pocket knife, he carefully pried up one board, then another, revealing a space beneath. Lewis knelt beside him, heart racing as Dion directed his flashlight into the opening. There, wrapped in oilcloth similar to what had protected the journal, was a metal box about the size of a small suitcase. "This is it," Themba breathed, his voice tight with emotion. Together, Lewis and Dion lifted the box from its hiding place. It was surprisingly heavy, requiring both of them to set it carefully on the desk. "Should we open it here?" Maya asked, glancing nervously toward the door. "We need to know what we're dealing with," Lindiwe said. But quickly, Lewis untied the oilcloth wrapping, revealing a metal strongbox with a combination lock. "Does the microfilm mention the combination?" Themba nodded, consulting the magnified image again. "It's encoded, based on the date of Mandela's arrest, 581964. Lewis carefully turned the dial, feeling each number click into place. When he entered the final digit, the lock released with an audible snap. He lifted the lid to reveal dozens of items carefully packed in layers of cloth. On top was an envelope, addressed simply, "To the keeper of the collection." Lewis opened it carefully, finding a letter written in the same meticulous handwriting as the journal. "If you are reading this, then you have accepted a sacred trust. These items represent not merely objects, but the living heritage of a people who were told their culture was worthless. Each piece carries stories that connect past to future. The complete inventory is included, along with documentation of provenance and cultural significance. The most important papers, those documenting the systematic removal of artifacts to European institutions, are in a separate waterproof pouch at the bottom of the collection. This is only the beginning. Other collections are scattered throughout the country, their locations revealed in sequence through clues contained within this first set. Proceed with wisdom and courage. N.R. Mandela." Just as Lewis finished reading, they heard a sound that made them all freeze. Footsteps on the gravel path outside, approaching the library door. "Close it," Dion whispered urgently. Lewis quickly but quietly shut the metal box and secured the lock. Dion immediately switched off his flashlight, plunging them into darkness, broken only by thin slivers of moonlight through the windows. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Through the silence, Lewis could hear low voices conferring. Then, the wooden door creaked as someone pushed against it. Dion motioned silently for everyone to move behind the tall bookshelves that lined the far wall. Lewis and Maya carefully lifted the metal box between them, its weight requiring both their efforts to move silently. The door swung open. A flashlight beam swept across the room, catching dust particles in its path. Lewis held his breath, pressing back against the ancient shelves. "Someone's been here recently," a male voice said in accented English. "Look at the floor. The dust is disturbed." "Check everything," another voice commanded. "The desk, the shelves, the floor. According to our information, there's a hidden compartment somewhere in this room." The beam of light moved methodically around the library, occasionally stopping to examine something more closely. Lewis could see now that there were two men, both wearing dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by the shadows. The light swept closer to their hiding place. Maya squeezed Lewis's arm in warning. He felt the weight of the box growing heavier in his arms, muscles tensing with the effort of holding it perfectly still. The flashlight beam paused on the desk, highlighting the area where they had removed. "The floorboards! Here!" one of the men exclaimed. "The floor's been opened!" Both men rushed to the spot, kneeling to examine the hiding place. Lewis watched as one reached into the cavity, his expression changing from excitement to anger when he found it empty. "It's gone," he said flatly. "Someone's beaten us to it." "Impossible," the other insisted. "Our information was clear. No one has accessed this location in years." "Well, someone has now," the first man replied, standing and brushing dust from his knees. "Recently, too. The dust hasn't settled back yet." The second man pulled out a mobile phone. "I need to call this in. The boss won't be happy." While they were distracted with the call, Dion caught Lewis's eye and nodded toward a second door at the back of the library that they hadn't noticed earlier. Carefully, moving inch by inch, the group began edging toward it. The floorboards betrayed them. Under the weight of Lewis and Maya carrying the box, an ancient board creaked loudly in the silence. Both men whirled around, flashlights immediately swinging toward the sound. "Someone's here!" one shouted, reaching under his jacket. "Run!" Dion commanded. Abandoning stealth, Lewis and Maya lurched forward with the box as Dion pushed open the back door. Themba and Lindiwe rushed through first, followed by Lewis and Maya with their precious cargo. Behind them, Lewis heard a shout, and then a sound that sent a chill through him, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. They emerged into a narrow alleyway between the library and another building. Dion pulled the door shut behind them and quickly wedged a fallen branch through the handle. "That won't hold them long," he warned. "To the vehicle, quickly!" They ran as best they could with their burden, following the path back toward where they had parked. Lewis could hear the men in the library pounding against the door, their angry shouts cutting through the night air. "Who are they?" Lewis gasped as they ran. "Likely private collectors," Lindewe replied, "or working for one." The door behind them splintered open. Flashlight beams swept the area, searching for them. "There!" A shout, followed by the sound of running footsteps. They reached the grove of trees where their SUV was hidden, piling in quickly. Dion started the engine but kept the lights off, pulling away slowly before accelerating once they were on the dirt track. Only when they were a kilometer away did he switch on the headlights, the vehicle bouncing roughly over the uneven ground as he pushed it to its limits. "Is everyone all right?" Lewis asked, looking around at his companions. They nodded, breathless and tense but unharmed. The metal box sat secure between Lewis and Maya in the back seat. "They'll follow us," Dion warned, checking the rearview mirror. "Once they get back to their vehicle, we need to find somewhere to examine the contents properly," Themba said. "And to rest. It's been a long day." "I know a place," Lindewe offered. "About 40 kilometers from here, a small lodge run by a friend. It's off the main roads, very private." Dion nodded. "Direct me." They drove in tense silence for several minutes, everyone watching for headlights behind them. Finally, Dion turned onto a larger road, able to increase their speed on the better surface. "I think we've gained some distance," he said after a while, "but we should assume they're still following." How did they know about the collection? Maya asked the question that had been bothering Lewis as well. "Rumors have circulated for years," Themba explained. "Many dismissed them as fantasy, but some took them seriously. The apartheid government knew Mandela was protecting cultural artifacts. It was one of the charges against him, though never proven in court." "And after apartheid ended?" Lewis asked. "Other interests emerged," Lindewe said. "Private collectors who specialize in African artifacts. Some museums seeking to expand their collections through unofficial channels." "Black market dealers," Maya translated. "Exactly. The artifacts we have here could be worth millions on the international market, but their true value, their cultural and historical significance, is incalculable." They drove for another hour, following increasingly remote roads until turning onto a narrow track that wound uphill through dense vegetation. Eventually, they emerged into a small clearing where several thatched cottages surrounded a central building, all dark except for a single light in what appeared to be a reception area. "We've arrived," Lindewe announced. "Kaya Lodge. My friend Sifo runs it. He's a history professor at the University of Cape Town. We can trust him completely." As they pulled up, a tall man with glasses emerged from the main building, looking surprised but pleased to see Lindewe. "This must be important," he said, after greeting her with a warm embrace. "You rarely arrive unannounced, especially at this hour." "It is important, Sifo," she confirmed. "We need your help and your discretion." He looked past her to the others, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized Lewis. "Of course," he said simply. "Come inside. Whatever you need, you are welcome here." As they entered the lodge, Lewis felt the adrenaline of their escape beginning to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. But alongside the fatigue was something else. a growing sense that what they had found was just the beginning of a much larger journey. The main room of Kaya Lodge was warm and inviting. Stone walls adorned with local artwork, comfortable furniture, arranged around a central fireplace where embers still glowed. Saifo quickly added more wood, bringing the fire back to life. "You must be hungry," he said, moving to a small kitchenette at the back of the room. "I can prepare something simple, while you explain why a Formula One champion is carrying a mysterious metal box through the Eastern Cape in the middle of the night." Lindiwe smiled at her friend's directness. Saifo and Lovu meet Lewis Hamilton. Also Themba Radebe, Maya Chen, and Dion Kumalo. Saifo nodded to each in turn. "Any friends of Lindiwe's are welcome here, but I sense this isn't a casual visit." "It's not," Lewis confirmed, carefully placing the metal box on a sturdy wooden table near the fire. "We've retrieved something important, something Nelson Mandela hid decades ago." Saifo's eyebrows rose. "The Mandela collection? I always thought that was academic folklore." "You've heard of it?" Lewis asked, surprised. "I'm a historian specializing in cultural heritage," Saifo explained, bringing a tray of bread, cheese, and fruit to the table. "There have been rumors for years about a collection of significant artifacts that Mandela and other ANC members protected before their imprisonment. Most scholars dismiss it as myth." "It's real," Themba said, patting the metal box. "And now, we have proof." As they ate, Lewis and Themba explained the events of the past 2 days. The letter, Robben Island, the journal, and their narrow escape from the mission. Saifo listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When they finished, he sat back, processing what he'd heard. "So others are searching for the collection as well," he said. "That complicates matters. We need a secure place to examine the contents," Dion said, "and to plan our next steps." "You're safe here for tonight," Saifo assured them. "My lodge is isolated, and I have no other guests this week. But we should be cautious. If these people are who I suspect, private collectors or their agents, they have resources and connections." Lewis nodded, fatigue temporarily forgotten as he turned to the metal box. "Can we open it now? I want to see exactly what we're protecting." Thiomai entered the combination, and the lock clicked open. Lewis carefully lifted the lid, revealing layers of cloth-wrapped items. The group gathered around as he gently removed the first bundle. Unwrapping it revealed a necklace of intricate beadwork, blues, reds, and whites arranged in geometric patterns, with small carved bone pieces interspersed among the beads. "Xhosa ceremonial necklace," Saifo identified immediately. Pre-colonial, likely from the early 1800s, worn by healers during important rituals. Lewis handed it to him carefully. Saifo examined it with reverent hands, turning it slowly to catch the firelight. "Museum quality," he confirmed. "But more than that. It's a cultural touchstone, something that connects modern Xhosa people to their ancestors." One by one, they unwrapped more items. A wooden staff with intricate carvings depicting animals and human figures, a set of small bones and stones in a leather pouch, copper bracelets with geometric etchings, clay pots with subtle, elegant designs. "These aren't just random artifacts," Saifo explained as they examined each piece. "They represent spiritual authority, cultural knowledge, historical continuity." During colonization and apartheid, such items were systematically confiscated or destroyed as part of erasing indigenous identity. At the bottom of the box, as Mandela's letter had indicated, was a waterproof pouch containing documents. Lewis carefully removed several folders of papers. These appear to be inventory records, Maya observed, leafing through them. Detailed lists of items removed from communities, with dates and destinations. And these, Themba added, examining. Another set of papers are correspondence between museum officials and government authorities discussing the acquisition of cultural items. Evidence of systematic cultural theft, Saifo said softly. This could support repatriation claims for artifacts not just from South Africa, but from across the continent. Lewis found another document at the bottom of the pouch, a hand-drawn map with annotations in Mandela's now familiar handwriting. It's the next location, he realized. Just as the letter said, the clue to finding the next part of the collection. Saifo studied the map over Lewis's shoulder. "I know this area," he said, pointing to the marked location. "It's a system of caves about 3 hours' drive from here. The local people consider it sacred ground, ancestral worship sites dating back thousands of years." "Is it accessible?" Dion asked. "With difficulty. The main cave can be reached by a hiking trail, but the smaller chambers require some climbing." Lewis studied the map more carefully, noticing symbols along the marked path that matched markings on the stone Themba had given him. "We should go tomorrow," he decided. "Early, before those men have a chance to track us here." The others agreed, and Saifo showed them to separate cottages where they could rest. Despite his exhaustion, Lewis found sleep elusive. He sat on the small porch of his cottage, staring at the brilliant southern stars, turning the limestone piece in his hand. Morning came quickly. After a simple breakfast, they repacked the metal box, leaving it with Saifo for safekeeping while they investigated the cave location. "Take my truck," Saifo offered, handing the keys to Dion. "It's better suited for the terrain, and take these as well." He presented them with several high-powered flashlights and a coil of climbing rope. "You're not coming?" Lindiwe asked. "I should stay here to protect the collection we already have," Saifo replied. "Besides, someone needs to watch for unwelcome visitors." The drive to the caves took them through increasingly rugged landscape. Rocky, hills covered in scrub vegetation, occasional baobab trees standing like sentinels against the sky. They left the main road for a dirt track, then eventually parked and continued on foot. "According to the map, the cave entrance should be just beyond that ridge," Themba said, consulting both the map and the marked stone as they hiked. The sun was high overhead when they reached the entrance, a dark opening in the hillside partially obscured by vegetation. Cool air flowed from inside, a welcome relief from the heat of the day. The local people call this place Isango Lememoya, Gateway of the Spirits, Lindiwe explained as they prepared to enter. "It's been a sacred site for thousands of years." Lewis switched on his flashlight, illuminating a passage that led deeper into the hillside. Ancient paintings adorned the walls, human figures, animals, and abstract symbols rendered in red ochre that had survived centuries. "These paintings are at least 2,000 years old," Lindiwe said, her voice hushed with respect. "Created by San people, the original inhabitants of this region." They moved deeper into the cave system, following the main passage as it descended gradually. The air grew cooler, the silence broken only by the occasional drip of water and their own cautious footsteps. After about 20 minutes, they reached a larger chamber where several smaller passages branched off. Consulting the map, Themba pointed to one on their right. "This way," according to Mandela's notes, "but it gets narrower." The side passage required them to proceed single file, occasionally ducking under low-hanging rock formations. Lewis felt a momentary claustrophobia, remembering his time in Mandela's cell. He took a deep breath, pushing through the sensation. Finally, the passage opened into a small chamber, maybe 3 meters across. Their flashlight beams revealed more rock paintings, these depicting what appeared to be ceremonial scenes, figures dancing around central objects held aloft. "There," Deon said, directing his light to a small crevice in the far wall. Lewis approached carefully, shining his light into the opening. Something gleamed in response, metal reflecting the beam. Reaching in, his fingers touched a cool metallic surface. Carefully, he withdrew a box, smaller than the one they had found at the mission, but decorated with intricate engravings. "Another piece of the puzzle," Themba said softly. Lewis opened the box, revealing several small figurines carved from wood and ivory, each wrapped individually in cloth. Beneath them was another letter in Mandela's handwriting and a small key. These pieces were hidden separately due to their particular significance, Lewis read aloud. They represent spiritual authority from various cultural traditions. The next location is indicated by the key, a place where water meets stone in perfect harmony. As Lewis finished reading, they heard a sound that made them all freeze, the distant echo of voices coming from the main passage they had followed into the cave. "Extinguish the lights," Deon whispered urgently. They switched off their flashlights, plunging the small chamber into darkness, broken only by the faint glow from the passage they had entered through. Lewis clutched the box of figurines to his chest, heart pounding as the voices grew louder. "How many?" Maya whispered. "At least 2, maybe more," Deon replied, his voice barely audible. They pressed themselves against the chamber walls, hoping the narrow side passage might go unnoticed by whoever was approaching. Lewis tried to control his breathing, the sound seeming thunderous in his own ears. A beam of light swept past the entrance to their passage, illuminating the main cavern beyond. The voices were clearer now, the same accented English they had heard at the mission. "The map shows a series of chambers," one voice said. "Fan out and check each one. They know exactly where to look," Themba whispered, his mouth close to Lewis's ear. "Someone has been feeding them information." Lewis nodded in the darkness, mind racing. How had they been tracked so quickly? Who else knew about Mandela's map? "There's another way out," Lindiwe breathed, barely audible. "Many of these cave systems have multiple exits. Look for air movement." Deon carefully switched on his flashlight, shielding it with his hand to create the smallest possible beam. He directed it around the chamber, looking for another opening. The light caught a narrow fissure in the far corner, partially hidden behind a rock formation. "There," he mouthed, pointing. Lewis could see it now, a crack in the rock wall, perhaps, wide enough for a person to squeeze through. But before they could move toward it, a voice called out from the main cavern. "Check that passage on the right." Footsteps approached their hiding place. Deon immediately switched off his light, and they pressed themselves flat against the walls again. Lewis felt the rough stone against his back, the small box of artifacts clutched tightly in his hands. A beam of light penetrated their chamber, sweeping slowly from side to side. Lewis held his breath as it passed inches from his face, then continued, around the small space. For a moment, he thought they had gone undetected. Then the beam snapped back, focusing directly on him. "Here!" a voice shouted. "I found them!" Everything happened at once. Deon lunged forward, tackling the figure in the row. Entrance! There was a grunt of pain, and the flashlight clattered to the ground, rolling across the uneven floor and casting wild shadows. "Go!" Deon shouted. "Through the fissure! Now!" Lewis pushed Maya toward the crack in the wall, then turned to help Themba. But the older man was already moving with surprising agility, sliding into the narrow opening. More shouts echoed from the main cavern, and flashlight beams bounced wildly as additional figures rushed toward their chamber. Lewis looked back to see Dion still wrestling with the first intruder. "Dion!" he called. "Go!" Dion repeated, struggling to maintain his hold. "I'll catch up." Lindiwe grabbed Lewis's arm, pulling him toward the fissure. "We have to move." With one last reluctant glance at Dion, Lewis tucked the box of artifacts inside his jacket and squeezed into the narrow opening. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and completely dark. He inched forward, feeling his way, acutely aware of the voices and sounds of struggle behind him. The fissure curved sharply, then widened slightly. Lewis felt air moving against his face, a good sign that it led somewhere. He heard Lindiwe and Themba breathing ahead of him, Maya close behind. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the cave, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. The sound reverberated in the enclosed space, sending a spike of fear through Lewis's chest. "Dion," Maya gasped. Lewis wanted to turn back, but the narrow passage made it impossible. They could only continue forward, moving as quickly as possible through the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, the passage widened further. Lewis's outstretched hand found empty space instead of rock wall, and he realized they had reached another chamber. "Wait," Themba whispered from somewhere ahead. A moment later, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating their surroundings. They were in a smaller cavern with a low ceiling. Water trickled down one wall, forming a small pool in the corner. Most importantly, there appeared to be another passage leading away from the chamber, larger than the fissure they had squeezed through. "This way," Lindiwe said, already moving, "toward the new passage. It should lead back to the surface." "What about Dion?" Lewis asked, his voice tight with concern. Themba's expression was grim. "We heard a gunshot. We must assume the worst and keep moving. If he's able, he'll find his way out." Lewis knew Themba was right, but leaving someone behind felt wrong on a fundamental level. Still, they had little choice. The artifacts they carried were clearly worth killing for. That much was now painfully clear. They followed the new passage as it sloped gradually upward. After several tense minutes, Lewis noticed the air becoming fresher, the darkness less absolute. Eventually, the passage opened onto a steep, rocky slope partially covered with vegetation. They emerged into late afternoon sunlight, blinking after the darkness of the caves. They were on the opposite side of the hill from where they had entered, overlooking a valley dotted with acacia trees. "We need to circle back to the truck," Lindiwe said, orienting herself. "But carefully. They might have someone watching it." They moved cautiously through the brush, keeping low and stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. The weight of the small box inside Lewis's jacket reminded him constantly of what was at stake, and potentially what it had already cost. As they approached the area where they had parked, Themba signaled for them to stop. They crouched behind a large boulder, peering carefully around it. Their fears were confirmed. Two men stood beside Sipho's truck, obviously waiting. A third man sat inside a black SUV parked nearby, the same vehicle they had seen at the mission. "We're trapped," Maya whispered. "They have our transportation, and we're in the middle of nowhere." Lewis was about to suggest they retreat and rethink their options when movement caught his eye. A figure emerged from the brush on the opposite side of the clearing. A man in a familiar museum uniform? "Is that?" Maya began. "The curator from the Robben Island Museum," Lindiwe confirmed, her voice hardening. "The one who gave us special access." They watched as the curator approached the waiting men, speaking animatedly and gesturing toward the cave entrance. "He's been tracking us from the beginning," Themba said softly, "feeding information to these people." Lewis felt a cold anger rising within him. Someone they had trusted had betrayed them, and possibly cost Dion his life. "What do we do now?" he asked, tightening his grip on the box of artifacts. "We need to get away from here," Themba said, his voice low but urgent. "There's a village about 5 kilometers east. We might find help there." Lewis nodded, carefully securing the box of figurines inside his jacket. The late afternoon sun was beginning to descend toward the horizon, giving them perhaps 2 hours of daylight to navigate unfamiliar terrain. "What about Dion?" Maya asked, voicing the concern that weighed on all of them. Lindiwe's expression was pained but resolute. "If he's alive, he'll find a way to contact us. For now, we need to protect what we have and get somewhere safe." They retreated silently into the brush, circling wide around the parked vehicles to avoid detection. Once they were well out of sight, they set a brisk pace eastward, following a game trail that wound through the scrubland. Lewis found himself scanning constantly for movement, every snapping twig or rustling leaf setting his nerves on edge. The weight of the box against his chest felt heavier with each step, not from its physical mass, but from what it represented and what it had potentially cost them. After nearly an hour of walking, the terrain began to change, the rocky scrubland giving way to more cultivated areas. In the distance, they could see scattered homesteads, round, thatch-roofed structures painted in bright colors. "That's the village," Themba confirmed. "Kwamanzini. I know someone there, a teacher who sometimes, helps Sifo with local history projects." The sun was touching the horizon as they approached the first houses. Children playing outside stopped to stare at the strangers, particularly at Lewis, whose appearance clearly marked him as not from the region. An elderly woman emerged from one of the homes, greeting Themba in Xhosa. They conversed briefly, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. She nodded and gestured for them to follow her. "She'll take us to Nomsa, the teacher," Themba explained, "and she's sending one of the children to bring her." They were led to a slightly larger building on the edge of the village. Inside was simple but comfortable: wooden furniture, colorful textiles, and bookshelves lining one wall. Their hostess urged them to sit, then disappeared briefly, returning with a pitcher of water and cups. Minutes later, a woman in her 40s entered, Nomsa, the teacher. She greeted Themba warmly, then spoke rapidly in Xhosa, periodically glancing at the others. "She says there have been strangers in the area for the past 2 days," Themba translated, "men in expensive vehicles asking questions about the caves and the old legends. The village elders refused to speak with them." Lindiwe nodded. "The collectors must have been researching the area even before we arrived at the mission." Nomsa served them a simple meal of corn porridge and stewed vegetables. As they ate, Themba explained their situation in broad terms, not mentioning the artifacts specifically, but emphasizing they needed transportation back to Sifo's lodge. "Nomsa says her brother has a truck," Themba reported. "He can take us in the morning. It's too dangerous to travel at night. The roads are poor, and there are often checkpoints." Lewis considered their options. Staying put felt risky, but moving at night through unfamiliar territory might be even more dangerous. "Ask if there's any way to get a message to Sifo," he suggested. "He needs to be warned about the curator." While Themba relayed this, Lewis carefully removed the box of figurines from his jacket. In the light of the kerosene lamp, he could examine it more closely. The box itself was beautifully crafted metal, copper or brass, with intricate engravings depicting animals and human figures in ceremonial poses. Inside, each figurine was individually wrapped in soft cloth. Lewis gently unwrapped one, a carved wooden figure about 6 inches tall, representing a woman with upraised arms. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail rendered with precision despite its age. "It's a fertility goddess," Lindiwe explained, seeing his interest. Such figures were central to agricultural ceremonies, asking the ancestors for good harvests. Lewis rewrapped it carefully and examined another, this one carved from ivory, depicting a seated man holding what appeared to be a staff or scepter, a representation of a chief or spiritual leader, Lindiwe said. The staff symbolizes his authority to communicate with the ancestors. As Lewis returned this second figure to its wrapping, he noticed something unusual. The cloth seemed thicker in one section. Running his fingers over it, he felt something solid hidden within the folds. "There's something else here," he said, carefully unwrapping the cloth further. Inside was a flat, circular object about the size of a coin. It appeared to be made of the same metal as the box, with symbols etched into its surface. "What is it?" Maya asked, leaning closer. Lewis turned it over in his palm. "I'm not sure. Some kind of token or medallion?" Themba, finished with his conversation with Nomsa, joined them at the table. His eyes widened at the sight of the metal disc. "That's Ukuvulwa, an opener," he said. Traditional healers used such talismans to open the way to the spirit world. But this one seems different. The markings aren't traditional. Lewis studied the etchings more carefully. "They look like coordinates?" Lindiwe took the disc, examining it under the lamp. "Not just coordinates. Look, there's a tiny microfilm embedded in the center." Sure enough, when tilted toward the light, a small transparent square could be seen set into the metal. Writing was visible on the film, but too small to read with the naked eye. "We need a magnifier," Lewis said, remembering how Themba had read the previous microfilm. Maya reached into her bag, producing her smartphone. "The camera can magnify it." She positioned the phone camera over the disc, using the digital zoom to enlarge the microfilm. The image on the screen revealed text and what appeared to be another map. "It's the final location," Themba said, reading the tiny text. "According to this, the main collection, what Mandela called the nation's memory, is hidden in Soweto." "Soweto?" Lewis repeated, surprised. "Not somewhere remote?" "Sometimes," Lindiwe said, "the best hiding place is in plain sight, where no one would think to look." As they studied the new information, a sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Voices were raised, people moving quickly past the windows. Nomsa went to the door, spoke with someone briefly, then turned back with an expression of alarm. "Vehicles are coming," Themba translated her rapid Xhosa. "Black SUVs, they've found us." "Out the back," Nomsa urged in accented English, gesturing toward a rear door. Lewis quickly rewrapped the figurines and the disc, securing the box inside his jacket. They followed Nomsa through the back of the house into a small vegetable garden surrounded by a reed fence. The sound of engines grew louder, at least 2 vehicles approaching from the main road into the village. Through gaps in the fence, Lewis could see headlights sweeping across the dusty paths between houses. "This way," Nomsa whispered, leading them along the fence line toward a cluster of trees at the edge of the village. "My brother's house." They moved quickly, but carefully, crouching low to stay below the fence line. In the village center, voices called out in English and Xhosa, questions being asked, villagers responding with deliberate vagueness. Nomsa's brother's home was smaller, but sturdier than most in the village, built of concrete block rather than traditional materials. A battered pickup truck sat beside it, partially hidden under a lean-to roof. A burly man emerged as they approached, exchanging quick words with his sister. He nodded grimly, then gestured for them to climb into the back of the truck, which was covered with a canvas tarp. "He'll take us to the next village," Themba explained as they crouched in the truck bed. "There's a bus station there with service to Johannesburg." "Johannesburg?" Maya asked. "Is that wise? It's a major city." "Soweto is on the outskirts of Johannesburg," Lindiwe explained. "And sometimes the best place to hide is in a crowd." The Tio truck's engine rumbled to life, the vibration traveling through the metal bed. Louis could hear Nomsa's brother speaking with someone outside, his tone casual, unhurried. Then they were moving, the truck bouncing over the uneven ground as it followed what felt like a back route away from the village. They rode in tense silence for nearly an hour, the only light coming from stars visible through small gaps in the canvas. Eventually, the truck slowed, turning onto what felt like a paved road. After another 20 minutes, it came to a stop. The canvas was pulled back, revealing Nomsa's brother. Behind him, Louis could see a small roadside bus station, a simple concrete shelter with a few benches, illuminated by a single streetlight. "The bus comes in 30 minutes, Themba translated after a brief conversation. "It will take us to Johannesburg Central Station. From there, we can reach Soweto." They thanked Nomsa's brother profusely. He nodded, pressing something into Themba's hand before climbing back into his truck and departing with a wave. "What did he give you?" Louis asked once the truck was out of sight. Themba opened his palm to reveal a small cell phone. "A prepaid phone. He thought we might need to communicate." "We should call Sifo," Lindiwe suggested. "Warn him about the curator." Themba nodded, stepping away to make the call. When he returned, his expression was grim. "No answer. I left a message, warning him to be careful, and telling him we're heading to Soweto." The night air was chilly as they waited for the bus. The rural darkness profound, except for the single streetlight. Louis found himself scanning the road constantly, expecting to see headlights approaching at any moment. "Do you think, Dion?" Maya began, then stopped, unable to finish the question. "He's a professional," Lindiwe said softly. "If anyone could survive that situation, it would be him." Louis nodded, wanting to believe it, but haunted by the memory of that gunshot echoing through the cave. He touched the box inside his jacket, wondering if any artifact, no matter how culturally significant, was worth a human life. The bus arrived precisely on schedule, an older but well-maintained vehicle with Johannesburg Express painted on its side. They boarded with a handful of other passengers, finding seats together near the back. As the bus pulled away, Louis finally allowed himself to relax slightly, the events of the day catching up with him. The gentle swaying of the vehicle and the hum of its engine had an almost hypnotic effect, and despite his intention to remain vigilant, he soon drifted into an uneasy sleep. He woke to Themba gently shaking his shoulder. The bus was pulling into a large, brightly lit terminal bustling with activity despite the late hour. "Johannesburg," Themba said. "We're here." They disembarked, joining the flow of travelers moving through the station. Louis kept his head down, aware that even at this hour, he might be recognized in a major city. "We should find somewhere to rest for a few hours," Maya suggested. "None of us have slept properly since Cape Town." "There's a small hotel near here that doesn't require identification," Lindiwe said. "We can rest, then head to Soweto in the morning." They followed her through busy streets still active with nightlife, eventually reaching a modest establishment tucked between a restaurant and a convenience store. The desk clerk barely looked up as they checked in, accepting cash without question. In the privacy of their adjoining rooms, Louis finally removed the box from his jacket, setting it carefully on the bed. The physical weight lifted, but the responsibility remained. "We should examine the microfilm more carefully," he said. "Make sure we understand exactly where we're going in Soweto." Using Maya's phone camera again, they magnified the image on the microfilm embedded in the disc. The map showed a section of Soweto centered on what appeared to be a community center or public building. "I know this place," Lindiwe said, studying the image. "It's the Hector Peterson Memorial, named after a student killed during the 1976 Soweto uprising." "There's more text here," Themba noted, pointing to tiny writing along the edge of the film. He read slowly. "Beneath where the young warriors gathered, the nation's memory waits in darkness." "A riddle?" Maya asked. "Not exactly," Lindiwe replied. "The Soweto uprising began with student gatherings. They were protesting being forced to learn in Afrikaans rather than their native languages. So the collection is hidden somewhere beneath a gathering place," Lewis reasoned, "near the memorial." "There's a community center next to the memorial," Lindiwe confirmed, "built in the 1990s after apartheid ended. It stands on the site where students organized their protests in 1976. Lewis remembered entries from Mandela's CD journal, his emotional response to news of the Soweto uprising reaching him on Robben Island. How fitting that he would choose this location for the most significant part of the collection. "What do you think we'll find there?" he asked. Themba considered this. "Based on what we've found so far, I believe the final collection will be more comprehensive. A complete representation of South Africa's cultural heritage. Not just objects, but documentation." "The nation's memory," Lewis repeated the phrase from the microfilm. "Yes," Lindiwe agreed. "During apartheid, the government attempted to rewrite history, to portray black South Africans as without culture or significant past. These artifacts and documents prove otherwise." "And the documentation about museum acquisitions?" Maya asked. "Could change how the world views cultural heritage," Themba said solemnly. "Many European and American museums house African artifacts acquired during colonial periods. If Mandela collected evidence of how these items were obtained, it could support repatriation claims," Lindiwe finished. "Not just for South Africa, but potentially for many African nations." Lewis understood now why the stakes were so high, why people were willing to kill for these items. It wasn't just about the monetary value of the artifacts themselves, but about the power of narrative, about who controlled the story of a people's history. "We should try to rest," he said, suddenly aware of his exhaustion. "Tomorrow, we find the final collection and decide what to do with it." As he lay down, still fully clothed and too wary to properly undress, Lewis found himself thinking of Mandela in his cell on Robben Island, planning this elaborate protection of his people's heritage even while fighting for their basic freedom. The true purpose of their journey was becoming clearer, not just to find artifacts, but to complete a mission that had waited decades for the right moment and the right people to bring it to fruition. Morning came too quickly, gray light filtering through thin curtains as Lewis woke from a fitful sleep. For a moment, disorientation gripped him, the unfamiliar room, the events of the past days blurring together. Then reality snapped back into focus as his hand touched the metal box beside him on the bed. A soft knock at the connecting door preceded Maya's entrance, already dressed and alert despite the early hour. "Themba and Lindiwe are ready," she said. "We should move quickly." Lewis nodded, splashing water on his face from the bathroom sink. Looking in the mirror, he barely recognized himself, stubble darkening his jawline, fatigue shadowing his eyes. How far removed this was from his carefully managed public image? From the polished Formula One champion the world knew. They gathered in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones to avoid attracting attention from other guests. "I've arranged transportation," Lindiwe said. "A friend's car, more discreet than public transit." Outside, The Johannesburg morning was already humming with activity. Street vendors setting up, workers hurrying to jobs, taxis honking through, traffic. A gray sedan waited at the curb, an elderly man at the wheel who greeted Lindiwe with a warm embrace. During the drive to Soweto, Lewis stared through the window at the passing cityscape. Johannesburg was a study in contrasts, gleaming skyscrapers in the financial district giving way to modest neighborhoods, and then to the sprawling township of Soweto itself. A city within a city where much of South Africa's struggle for freedom had unfolded. Soweto has changed, Themba observed as they drove through its streets. When I was young, these were dirt roads. No electricity, no proper sanitation. Still much to improve, Lindiwe added, but progress has been made. They passed landmarks familiar to Lewis from documentaries and books: Orlando Stadium, the Regina, Mundi Church, where protesters had sought sanctuary during uprisings, and, eventually, the Hector Peterson Memorial itself, a simple but powerful tribute to the 12-year-old boy shot during the 1976 student protests. Lindiwe's friend dropped them a block away from the community center. Better not to arrive directly, she explained, in case someone is watching. They approached cautiously, circling the building to observe it from all angles. The center was a modest two-story structure with large windows and a small courtyard. A sign announced programs for youth education, elder care, and community meetings. It looks ordinary, Maya remarked. That was likely the point, Themba said. The best hiding place is one no one would think to search. The center was already open, community members coming and going, elders gathering for a morning social program, young mothers dropping children at daycare. They entered casually, Lindiwe taking the lead. "We're here to see the historical archives," she told the receptionist, a young woman with bright beaded earrings, "for a research project on community development." The receptionist nodded, directing them to a small room on the ground floor marked Community History. Inside were shelves of binders, photographs, and newspaper clippings, the documented history of Soweto, preserved by its own people. Once alone in the room, Themba consulted the microfilm image again. "Beneath, where the young warriors gathered," he repeated. "Not this room, somewhere below us." Lewis examined the floor, looking for any sign of a trap door or unusual access point. Nothing was immediately visible. "The basement, perhaps?" Maya suggested. "Most of these buildings don't have proper basements," Lindiwe said, running her hand along the edge of a bookshelf. Wait, she had found something, a slight gap between the bookshelf and the wall. When she pressed against the shelf at a certain angle, it moved, revealing it was hinged on one side. "A hidden door," Lewis said, impressed. Behind the bookshelf was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. They glanced at each other, then Lewis switched on his phone's flashlight and led the way down. The stairs ended in a small underground room with a concrete floor and walls. Metal shelving lined the walls, stacked with waterproof containers. In the center of the room stood a larger metal chest, similar to what they had found at the mission, but considerably bigger. "This is it," Themba breathed, his voice hushed with reverence. "The main collection." Lewis directed his light around the room, taking in the extent of what Mandela had managed to preserve. Dozens of containers, each likely holding artifacts similar to what they had already found. And the large chest, what did it contain? "Should we open it?" he asked, approaching the central chest. Themba nodded. The combination should be the same as before. Lewis turned the dial, entering the sequence based on Mandela's arrest date. The lock clicked open just as the others had. Inside, neatly organized in archival folders, were hundreds of documents, photographs, letters, inventory lists, receipts, official correspondence. On top was a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To the Keeper." With careful fingers, Lewis opened it, unfolding the letter inside. The now familiar handwriting filled the page. "You have found what I could not return myself." These documents represent more than a collection of artifacts. They are evidence of a systematic attempt to erase a people's heritage and history. The inventory lists detail over 3,000 items taken from South African communities between 1880 and 1980. The accompanying documentation proves many were acquired through coercion, confiscation, or theft during colonial and apartheid rule. My hope was always that these items would one day return to their communities of origin, or at least to museums within South Africa, where our people could reconnect with their heritage. You who have followed this path now face a choice of great consequence. How will you use what you have found? Will you seek restitution, education, reconciliation? The path forward is yours to determine. But remember that these treasures belong not to any individual, but to a nation's shared heritage. Choose wisely and with courage. N.R. Mandela Lewis looked up from the letter to find the others watching, him expectantly, the weight of decision heavy in the air between them. "What do we do now?" Maya asked softly. Lewis realized he was facing perhaps the most important decision of his life, far more significant than any choice he had ever made on a racetrack. Lewis carefully folded Mandela's letter and looked around at the room full of cultural treasures, the physical manifestation of a heritage that powerful forces had tried to erase. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, simultaneously heavy and strangely energizing. "We need to document everything before we make any decisions," he said finally. "If these items and documents are as significant as they appear, we need a complete record." Maya nodded, already pulling out her phone. "I can photograph the documents, create a digital backup." "Good idea," Lindaway agreed. "But we should move quickly. We don't know if we've been followed to Soweto." They worked methodically, Maya photographing each document from the central chest, while Lewis and Themba carefully inventoried the containers on the shelves. Lindiwe stood watch near the staircase, alert for any sounds from above. The scale of Mandela's collection became increasingly apparent as they worked. Beyond the artifacts themselves, the beadwork, carvings, ceremonial items, and traditional tools, the documentation was extensive and meticulously organized. "Look at this," Maya said, holding up a folder. "Correspondence between museum officials in London and colonial administrators discussing how to remove tribal objects from communities." Lewis examined another document, a register listing hundreds of items taken from various regions, with notations about where they were sent. British Museum, Paris, Berlin, New York. This isn't just about South African heritage, he realized. This documentation could support repatriation claims across the African continent. "Exactly," Themba said. Mandela understood that cultural liberation was part of true freedom, not just for South Africa, but for all peoples whose heritage was dispersed during colonization. After 2 hours of careful documentation, they had a comprehensive digital record of the collection. Now came the harder question: what to do with the physical items themselves? "We can't move everything at once," Lindiwe pointed out. "There's too much." "And we can't leave it here," Themba added. "Now that others know we're searching for the Iikwes collection, this location isn't secure." Lewis paced the small room, considering their options. His racing career had taught him to make decisions under pressure, to find solutions when there seemed to be none. "I have an idea," he said finally, "but it will require resources and commitments beyond what we have here." He outlined his plan, Using his platform as a global sports figure, he would establish a foundation dedicated to identifying, documenting, and, where appropriate, repatriating cultural artifacts taken during colonial periods. The foundation would work with communities, museums, and governments to ensure items were returned to their places of origin or properly displayed with accurate historical context. "We can start with this collection," he explained. "Create a secure facility where the items can be studied, documented, and prepared for return to their communities. The documentation can be used to support broader repatriation efforts globally." "That's ambitious," Maya said carefully. "It's necessary," Lewis replied. "Anything less would fail to honor what Mandela was trying to achieve. And it will require long-term commitment, not just funding but personal involvement." "What about your racing career?" Lindy asked. "A project of this scale would demand significant time and attention." Lewis nodded, acknowledging the implicit question. "Some things are more important than racing. This is one of them." They continued discussing the logistics, how to secure the collection immediately, who to trust with knowledge of its existence, how to structure the foundation for maximum impact. As they talked, Lewis felt a clarity of purpose unlike anything he had experienced before. A sudden noise from upstairs interrupted their planning. Footsteps, then voices, including one with the familiar Eastern European accent they had heard. "At the mission and the caves. They've found us," Lindy whispered, her eyes wide. Lewis quickly scanned the room, looking for another exit. There was none. The staircase was the only way in or out. "We need to hide the existence of this room," he decided. "Maya, take the drive with the photos. Themba, help me close the most important documents in this container." He selected a watertight case from the shelves, filling it with the key documents Maya had already photographed. The evidence of systematic cultural appropriation that could support repatriation claims. "What about the rest?" Lindy asked, gesturing to the shelves of artifacts. "We'll have to leave them for now," Lewis said grimly. "But with the documentation and digital records, we can return for them once we've established proper security." The footsteps grew closer. Someone was definitely searching the building. Lewis sealed the case, then led the group back up the narrow stairs. At the top, he carefully pulled the bookshelf back into position, concealing the entrance to the hidden room. They had barely settled into casual positions, pretending to examine the public historical archives, when the door opened. Two men entered, one of the same figures from the cave, accompanied by the museum curator who had betrayed them. "Mr. Hamilton," the curator said with a tight smile, "what a surprise to find you here. I thought you'd be preparing for Monaco." Lewis met his gaze steadily. "I'm taking some time to learn about South African history. It's fascinating." The curator's eyes narrowed. "And what have you found in your historical research?" "That the past is always more complex than it first appears," Lewis replied evenly, "and that some people will betray trust for the right price." The curator flinched slightly, but recovered quickly. "I prefer to think of it as ensuring artifacts reach those who can properly care for them. Private collectors often have better resources than underfunded museums. Or communities trying to reconnect with their own heritage?" Lindiwe challenged. The second man stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Enough conversation. Where is the Mandela collection? We know you've been tracking it." "I'm afraid you've wasted your time," Lewis said calmly. "We haven't found anything called the Mandela collection, just public historical archives." The man's expression hardened. "Search them," he ordered the curator. Lewis tensed, aware of the container hidden beneath his jacket. But before the curator could move, the door opened again, and Dion walked in, followed by two uniformed police officers. "These are the men, officers," Dion said, pointing to the curator and his companion. "The ones who fired at me in the cave and have been pursuing stolen cultural artifacts." The next few minutes unfolded in a blur of activity. Officers reading rights, the curator protesting his innocence, his companion lapsing into sullen silence. Through it all, Lewis could hardly take his eyes off Dion, alive and apparently unharmed. When the police had taken the two men away, promising to return for statements, Lewis finally embraced his security guard. "We thought you were..." "Nearly was," Dion admitted. "The bullet grazed my shoulder. I managed to find my way out of the cave system and contacted local authorities. Then I called Saifo, who told me you were headed to Soweto." "Perfect timing," Maya said, relief evident in her voice. "Not timing. Planning," Dion corrected with a small smile. "I've been waiting outside for hours, watching for trouble." With the immediate threat neutralized, they returned to the question of the collection. Lewis shared his plan for a foundation dedicated to cultural repatriation. "It will take time," he acknowledged, "and resources. But with the documentation we've found, we can make a real difference, not just for South African communities, but potentially for cultural heritage across Africa and beyond." Themba placed a hand on Lewis's shoulder. "Mandela chose well," he said simply. "You understand that this is not about possessing these items, but about restoring them to their rightful places." Lewis nodded, feeling both the weight and the honor of the task ahead. 1 year from now, he would be standing not on a winner's podium, but on a different kind of platform, one from which he could help right historical wrongs and reconnect communities with their cultural heritage. The promise made by Mandela decades ago in a prison cell on Robben Island was about to be fulfilled. 1 year later, the new Cultural Heritage Center gleamed in the Johannesburg sunshine, its modern architecture incorporating traditional African design elements. A crowd had gathered outside, community leaders, government officials, museum representatives from around the world, and members of the press. They were there for the official opening, but also for the announcement that had been generating buzz in international media for weeks. Inside, in a private room away from the gathering crowd, Lewis Hamilton adjusted his tie, the unfamiliar formality of the suit, a reminder of how much his life had changed in the past year. The room was filled with display cases containing selected items from the Mandela collection, each beautifully presented with detailed information about its cultural significance and origin. "Ready?" Maya asked, entering with a tablet in hand. "They're all waiting." Lewis nodded, taking a deep breath. "Is everyone here?" Themba and Lindiwe are already seated on stage. Sifo is showing the European Museum representatives through the research facility, and Dion is doing a final security sweep, as always. Lewis smiled at that. After their adventure a year ago, Dion had become the head of security for the new foundation, bringing the same quiet vigilance to protecting cultural heritage that he had once provided for Lewis personally. They walked together through the center's main exhibition hall, a soaring space where carefully selected artifacts from the collection were displayed. Unlike traditional museum exhibitions, these displays were designed in consultation with the communities from which the items originated. Each included not just historical information, but contemporary context, how these cultural traditions continued in modern South Africa. Most importantly, each display noted clearly that the items were on temporary exhibition before being returned to their communities of origin or to local museums near those communities. This wasn't a permanent collection, but a way station on a journey home. The crowd outside hushed as Lewis emerged onto the stage, set up at the center's entrance. Camera flashes erupted, and he was momentarily transported back to podium ceremonies and press conferences from his racing days. But the faces looking back at him were different. Elders from various South African cultural groups, historians, community leaders, people who had fought alongside Mandela during the struggle against apartheid. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "1 year ago, I stood in Nelson Mandela's cell on Robben Island and received a letter that would change the course of my life." He recounted the journey, finding the first cache of artifacts at the mission, the discoveries in the cave, and finally, the main collection in Soweto. He explained the Foundation's mission to document, preserve, and ultimately return cultural heritage items to their communities of origin. Today, I'm proud to announce that the first 50 items from the Mandela collection will be officially returned to communities across South Africa next month, Lewis continued. But this is just the beginning. He explained how the documentation found with the collection had led to identifying thousands of South African cultural items in museums and private collections around the world. The Foundation had already secured agreements for the return of hundreds of these items. More significantly, Lewis said, his voice growing more passionate, the evidence gathered by Nelson Mandela has provided a blueprint for other African nations seeking the return of their cultural heritage. We're now working with partners in 12 countries to support similar repatriation efforts. The audience applauded, many rising to their feet. Lewis acknowledged their response with a nod, then continued, "But today, I want to share something I haven't spoken about publicly before. The reason I believe Mandela chose me for this task." The crowd quieted, leaning forward with interest. Lewis reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the small stone from the quarry that Themba had sent with the original letter. "When I first received this stone, I thought it was simply symbolic, a piece of Robben Island representing Mandela's journey. Later, I discovered it contained coordinates and clues leading to the hidden collection." He turned the stone in his fingers, the morning sunlight catching its pale surface. "But there was one more secret I discovered only after we had secured the collection. Hidden within this stone was a personal letter addressed specifically to whoever would complete Mandela's mission." Lewis unfolded a small piece of paper, its edges worn from multiple readings over the past year. The letter reads, "To the Keeper of Heritage. If you are reading these words, you have followed a path few would choose. You might wonder why you were selected for this task, when it could have been entrusted to historians, museum officials, or government authorities." Lewis paused, his voice becoming more personal. "Years ago, I learned of a young racing driver who donated anonymously to children's education programs in South Africa. No publicity was sought, no recognition requested. This told me more about your character than any public achievement. True integrity is what one does when no one is watching." Murmur ran through the crowd. Lewis had never spoken publicly about his early charitable giving in South Africa, done quietly when he was first establishing himself in Formula One. "The treasures you have found are valuable not for their materials, but for the connections they represent between past and future, between people and their heritage. They require a guardian who understands that true worth lies not in possession, but in preservation and return." Lewis looked up from the letter, meeting the eyes of those gathered before him. "I believe you are such a person. The path forward may require sacrifice of things you value, but I hope you will find, as I did in my cell, that purpose provides a freedom that transcends circumstance. With faith in your journey, N.R. Mandela." Lewis refolded the letter. The audience remained silent, absorbing the weight of Mandela's words. Then, slowly, they rose to their feet, applause building to a thunderous ovation. Lewis nodded his acknowledgement, emotion tightening his throat. Beside him on stage, Themba smiled with quiet approval, while Lindiwe wiped away tears. When the applause finally quieted, Lewis stepped back to the microphone for his final announcement. Today, I am officially announcing my retirement from Formula One racing to dedicate myself fully to this foundation and its mission. Despite rumors that had circulated for months, the definitive statement sent another ripple through the crowd. Some might see this as giving up one dream for another. I see it differently. Throughout my racing career, I fought to break barriers and create space for those who would come after me. This work is a continuation of that same journey, helping communities reclaim what was taken, reconnect with their heritage, and rebuild what was broken. He held up the quarry stone one last time. Mandela said this stone reminded him that even the hardest substance can be shaped by persistence. The barriers of prejudice and historical injustice may seem as solid as stone, but with persistence, with commitment to truth and reconciliation, they too can be reshaped. As he concluded his speech, the morning sun crested fully over the Cultural Heritage Center, illuminating the gathered crowd in golden light. Lewis Hamilton, no longer just a champion driver, but now a keeper of cultural memory, felt Mandela's presence as clearly as if the great man stood beside him. The stone from Robben Island had completed its journey, transforming from a prisoner's keepsake to a key unlocking heritage, and finally to a symbol of promise fulfilled. Like Lewis himself, it had become something more than its origins might have predicted. Proof that even the most unlikely elements could become instruments of healing and restoration when guided by the right hands. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to know which corner of the world this story has reached. If you enjoyed this tale of courage, history, and transformation, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that blend fact with fiction. Don't forget to share this video with friends and family who might appreciate it. By spreading these stories, we help raise awareness about important historical events and cultural heritage, while promoting values of kindness, perseverance, and understanding. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.